No, I will not marry him. Ha-jun shouted, his fist hitting the wooden table until the crystal glass fell and broke into pieces. Opposite him, an authoritative old man sat with a cold expression. Kang Dae-ho, Ha-jun's father, doesn't show the slightest emotion. You have no choice, he said in a voice as sharp as a knife. This wedding has to happen tonight. In the corner of the room stood a woman in a shabby uniform and head bowed. Yura, the housekeeper who has been almost invisible, is now the center of a storm that is spinning in the Kang family. Outside, the Seoul sky is cloudy, the wind rustles sharply. However, inside that room, the temperature dropped not by the weather, but by the tension hanging in the air. Ha-jun looked at Yura with hateful eyes. He's nobody, she said coldly. Why should I? But before the answer came out, a loud bang shook the mansion. The front door opened violently, and several men in black barged in. One of them took a deep breath before whispering in a hasty tone, Jin BTS. He knows everything. The living room door was still shaking after being knocked down. Ha-jun twisted his body sharply, staring at the man in black who had just brought the shocking news. BTS Jin knows everything. The words hung in the air, creating an eerie silence. Amidst the shock, Kang Dae-ho finally stood up from his chair, his normally calm face now turning dark. What do you mean? He asked in a dangerous voice. The man swallowed. Kim Seekjin, he's been investigating us. He knows about this marriage, about Yura's secrets, and, before the sentence was finished, a loud voice sounded. Ha-jun punches the wall in an explosive rage. Why would an idol like him interfere in my family's affairs? What does this have to do with anything? Yura, who had been silent since then, raised his head with his eyes wide open. There was something in his eyes, not fear, not surprise, but more like resignation. As if this wasn't the first time his life had been controlled by stronger hands. Meanwhile, somewhere in a corner of Seoul, BTS's Jin stared at his phone screen with a sharp expression. Her name is indeed known for her charm on stage, but tonight, she is not a superstar. Tonight, he is a man who has just discovered the truth that could destroy everything. I have to stop this before it's too late, he muttered. Then, without hesitation, he dialed someone's number. The phone rang 3 times before a tired voice from the other side answered. Jin, why are you calling me so late? Jin took a deep breath before finally saying, Ha-jun is in danger. And Yura, he's not who we thought he was. Seoul's night breeze blew as Jin stood on the balcony of his apartment, gazing into the gloom of the glittering city. The phone was still in his ear, but there was no sound on the other side. Ha-jun is in danger. And Yura, he's not who we thought he was. Finally, the voice on the other end of the phone whispered quietly, as if afraid that someone was eavesdropping. What do you mean, Jin? Jin wiped his face in frustration. I found something. Documents. About Kang's family, and about Yura. A long pause. Then the voice said, Where did you find him? Jin grasped the balcony railing tighter. Someone sent it to me, but I'm sure it's not a coincidence. Someone wants me to know. Elsewhere, inside the Kang family's stately home, Ha-jun still stares at his father with hardened jaws. I will not marry her, he said in a voice full of resistance. Kang Dae-ho looked at her coldly. You think this is about choice? He grinned. It's about survival, Ha-jun. If you don't marry Yura, you will die. Ha-jun's blood dripped. What do you mean? But before there was an answer, Yura finally spoke up for the first time that night. His voice was calm, but it contained a fear that could not be hidden. He is right, young master. Ha-jun turned his head, looking at Yura with sharp eyes. What? Yura lowered his head. If you refuse to marry me, they will kill you. Outside the house, behind the darkness of the night, someone stood silently under the rain, observing the window of the Kang family's house. Her figure was imperceptibly defined, but something shimmered in her hands. A mobile phone. The screen lit up, displaying one name. Kim Seekjin. Someone just recorded the whole conversation. It was raining heavily outside the Kang family home. The mysterious figure standing in the shadows remained silent, watching every movement inside the luxurious mansion. His fingers typed quickly on the phone screen, sending a recording of the conversation to a contact who was only saved with one letter. Jade inside. Ha-jun was still transfixed, his eyes staring intently at Yura. Who wants to kill me? His voice was lower this time, almost like a whisper. Yura bit her lips. Hands trembled as she clenched her shabby skirt. I I can't tell you. Ha-jun laughed sarcastically. So, I have to marry a maid who is hiding something from me? You know that doesn't make sense, right? Kang Daeho interrupted in a cold voice. Yura is not just a maid. The room was quiet again. Ha-jun turns to his father, eyebrows furrowed. What do you mean? Before there was an answer, the ringing sound of a cell phone broke the tension. One of Kang Daeho's men receives a call, and his face immediately pales. Sir, he ran away. Everyone froze. Kang Daeho squinted. Who? The man gulped before replying. The one who brought the document to BTS's Jin. Elsewhere, BTS's Jin sits in a speeding black car. His face was tense as he read the latest message on his phone, envelope with thorough recording sent. They know about this marriage. You have to stop Ha-jun before it's too late. Jin clenched his hands. Damn, this is bigger than I thought. The driver in front of him glanced through the rearview mirror. Sir, where are we now? Jin thought for a moment. There are two options. Meet Ha-jun in person, or find the person who sent him the document. But before he could make up his mind, the sound of gunfire echoed through the night streets of Seoul. The tires exploded. The vehicle wobbled and spun wildly before finally hitting the pavement. Jin staggered forward. His head almost hit the dashboard. His breath was hunting, and as he raised his face, his eyes caught something in the distance. Someone stood in the rain, looking directly at him. The person is wearing a black jacket. His face is covered with a mask. But what gives the genie goosebumps is not only her figure, it is what she holds in her hands, his own phone. With a screen that displays the active call to the genie number, BTS's Jin stared at the figure in the distance with a pounding heart. The rain intensified, adding a gloomy impression to the black-hooded figure still standing in the middle of the street, clutching his cell phone. The call is still on. Jin glanced at his phone's flashing screen, displaying an unknown number. Then, a hoarse voice is heard from the speakers. Stop trying to find out, Jim. You've gone too far. Before Jin could respond, a gunshot rang out again, this time closer. The driver shouted, Sir, we have to go. But Jin couldn't move. He could only stare at the figure, who slowly stepped back before disappearing in a narrow alley, leaving his phone, which had now fallen into a puddle. Who is he? How did he get Jin's number? And most importantly, what really happened in the Kang family? Meanwhile, at the Kang family home, Ha-jun is still standing in the middle of the room, his eyes locked on Yura. His father's words still rang in his head. Yura is not just an assistant. Who are you really? Ha-jun's voice is low, but full of pressure. Yura looked doubtful, his hands clenched at his sides. Finally, with a heavy breath, he whispered, Me. Can't say. Ha-jun snorted. Of course. But before he could step away, someone barged into the room. One of Kang Daeho's men, his face panicked. Sir, BTS Jin had an accident. Someone tried to kill him. The room instantly froze. Ha-jun immediately turns to his father, but to his surprise, Kang Daeho smiles faintly as if he had expected this to happen on the other side of the room. Yura paled. Her fingers trembled as she realized one terrible thing. This was all happening faster than she thought. Jin is in danger. And he knew he was the only one who could save her. It was still raining in Seoul as BTS's Jin sat in the ambulance, his head throbbing from the impact. His eyes stared blankly out the window, his mind still stuck on one question. Who tried to kill him? The mysterious phone that fell on the street is now in his hands. The screen cracked, but the last call that was still stored made his fur bristle. Telephone receiver unknown number duration. 13 seconds. Jin pressed the redial button. The number you are calling cannot be reached. Shit, I in the Kang family's house. Yura was still standing still, his fingers clasping her shabby skirt tightly. He knows he doesn't have much time. If he does not act now, then where are you going? Ha-jun's cold voice stopped his steps. Yura froze in the doorway. He's not looking. I know you want to see Jin. Ha-jun continued, his voice lower this time. Why? Are you hiding something from me too? Yura bit his lip. He can't answer, but he knew one thing. If he remained in this house, they would all die. Elsewhere. A cold night envelopes Seoul as BTS's Jin stands in front of the gates of Kang's family home. His breathing is heavy, his mind is chaotic. Who sent that message? And more importantly, what do they know about Yura? Jin held his phone tightly. On the screen, the message is still on. Envelope with arrow, you want to know who Yura really is? Meet me where you first saw him. He swallowed and stepped in. Inside the house, Yura sat on the edge of his small bed in the servant's room. His hands trembled, his eyes staring blankly toward the floor. He knew this would happen sooner or later. The secret that he had hidden for so many years would not be able to continue to be buried. A knock on the door made him gasp. Yura turned his head quickly, and in the doorway, Hajun stood with a face that was hard to read. He's here. Yura's heart was pounding. Who? Jin BTS. Yura immediately stood up. He must stop the genie before he finds out something that should have remained hidden. Jin stepped into the house. His eyes swept the room carefully. He knows someone is watching him. The game is not over yet. At the end of the corridor, a well-built man was waiting for her. Kang Dae-ho, what are you doing here? Kim Seokjin. His voice is sharp. Jin looked at him without fear. I came to see Yura. Kang Dae-ho smiled slightly. Why? Because someone sent you an anonymous message? You think I don't know? Jin nodded. You're hiding something about him. Before Kang Dae-ho could answer, a quick step sounded. Yura appeared on the stairs, his eyes full of panic. Jin, you have to go. But it's too late. Jin's phone vibrated again. Envelope with arrow too slow, Seokjin. The secret will be revealed tonight. Jin felt his hair stand up. He raised his head, looking at Yura, whose face was now deathly pale. What do they know about you, Yura? Yura did not answer. His eyes were filled with fear. Outside the house, someone stood in a black car, watching them with a cold smile. On the dashboard of his car, a laptop opens, displaying an old document with one name that is now the center of it all. Pushpin, Yura Kang, the lost heir. Seoul's night sky was filled with dark clouds as Yura stood still in the middle of the room, his body feeling as if frozen. Jin's words were still hanging in the air. What do they know about you, Yura? Jin looked at her with a questioning glare, but Yura couldn't answer. Not now. Not in front of Kang Dae-ho. Suddenly, a notification sound came from Jin's phone. He glanced at the screen, and as soon as he saw the message that had just come in, his eyes widened. Envelope with arrow, it's time you knew the truth, Seokjin. Yura is not an assistant. He is the only legitimate heir of the Kang family. Jin looked at Yura with an expression of disbelief. You, the heir of the Kang family? Kang Dae-ho let out a long sigh before finally speaking. He's not just an heir. His voice sounded flat, but it was full of pressure. He should have died years ago. Jin felt the tension thicken. What do you mean? Dae-ho walked over, his eyes sharp. Someone wanted to remove him from this world a long time ago. I'm just following orders. Yura felt his body relax. So it was his own adoptive father who wanted to get rid of him. Jin clenched his hands. So, you've been hiding her as a maid all this time? Dae-ho grinned. It's easier to make people die if they don't have an identity. Silence enveloped the room. Yura felt his heart beating so fast that he could barely breathe, but then boom, a loud voice sounded from outside. Explosion. A red-hot fire immediately rose in the front yard of the Kang family's house. People were screaming. The windows shook. Jin immediately moved quickly, pulling Yura behind him. We have to get out of here. Kang Dae-ho looked surprised, but his expression immediately turned wary. He grabbed his phone and shouted, Tighten security. Don't let anyone in or out. But it's too late. In the midst of smoke and fire, someone appeared behind the darkness. The black-veiled figure that had been shadowing them all this time was now standing on the scorched threshold, looking directly at Yura. In his hand, a gun pointed straight at his heart. I finally found you, Yura Kang. The fire is still burning outside the Kang family's house, black smoke rising high into the night sky. On the scorched threshold, a figure in a black hood stood firmly, a pistol in his hand pointed straight at Yura's chest. I finally found you, Yura Kang. The man's voice was deep and cold, like a dagger piercing the air. Yura froze. His whole body trembled, but not from fear, but rather because he recognized the voice. No way. He whispered almost inaudibly. Jin stepped forward, placing himself between Yura and the gunman. Who are you? What do you want from Yura? The figure slowly lowered its hood, revealing its face for the first time. A young man with piercing eyes and an emotionless expression. Old wounds adorned his temples, a sign that he was not a random person. "My name is Kong Minho," he said quietly, "and I am his brother." The world seemed to stop. Yura widened his eyes, his knees buckled for a moment. "Siblings," Kong Dae-ho, who had been silent for a while, finally spoke up in a low and threatening voice. "You should have died, Minho." Minho grinned coldly. "So it was with Yura, right?" She turned her gaze to Yura, her eyes scrutinizing every inch of his face. "You don't even remember me, do you?" Yura tried to open his mouth, but his voice was stuck in his throat. How could he have siblings and never know? Suddenly, Jin pulled Yura behind him even further. "If you're really his sibling, why did you come with a gun?" Minho chuckled, as if the question intrigued him. "He's the rightful heir, and someone wants him dead before this secret is revealed." Just as the words slid from his lips, the sound of footsteps rang out from outside. Kong Dae-ho's men began to surround the house with guns ready to fire. Kong Dae-ho squinted. "I won't let you take Yura." Minho just smiled. "I don't need your permission." Then it all happened in an instant. Minho pulls the trigger. Yura shouted. Jin moved faster. A powerful push hit Yura as Jin threw him to the floor, just before the sound of gunfire echoed through the room. "Blood." Jin nodded, his eyes widened. His hands were raised to his chest, where blood began to seep into his shirt. Yura shouted, "Jin." Minho was silent. His face looked a little surprised, as if he had no intention of hitting Jin. But now it's too late. Jin fell to the ground, his breath hunting. Yura crawled up to him, his hands trembling as he pressed the wound on his chest. "Please hold on. I'll save you." Amid the chaos, Minho raises his gun again, this time aiming at Kong Dae-ho. "It's none of your business, Mr. Kong." But before he could pull the trigger, another voice echoed from behind him. "Take off your weapons, Minho." All eyes turned to the door. There stood someone unexpected. A tall man with an expression full of anger. Her hair was wet with rain, but her eyes shone with indescribable anger. Kim Seok-jin, the other one. The Jin twins. Blood still pooled on the floor as silence enveloped the room. Jin lies weakly in Yura's arms, gasping for breath, while Minho still stands with a gun in his hand. But now, all eyes were on the one figure that had just appeared. Kim Seok-jin. Or rather, Jin's twin. Yura froze. His brain is trying to understand what just happened. Jin has a twin brother? How is that possible? Minho squints, quickly turning his gun to the man standing in the doorway. "Who are you?" The man stepped in, his eyes swept across the room sharply. He looks exactly the same as the genie, except for his darker, sharper, more dangerous gaze. "I was the one who should have died years ago," he said coldly. "But like Yura, I managed to survive." Kong Dae-ho looks pale. His hands clenched into fists, his eyes looking at the man with a fear rarely seen on his face. "This is impossible." Jin's eyes lit up with a smile. "Oh, but this is quite possible." She walks up to Minho without the slightest bit of fear, then whispers softly, "We have the same enemy." Minho stiffened. "What do you mean?" Jin's twin glances at Kong Dae-ho. "The one who wants Yura dead is the same one who wants me gone." Yura looked at the man with bewilderment and fear. "Who are you really?" The man finally looked at her. The look in his eyes softened for a moment before he said, "My name is Kim Jun." Jin groaned slowly, his body getting weaker. Yura immediately returned his focus to Jin, pressing the wound on his chest. "We have to save him," he exclaimed in panic, but before anyone could move, the sound of footsteps was heard from outside. Kong Dae-ho's men have surrounded the house with guns ready to fire. Kong Dae-ho chuckled a little, though his eyes were full of tension. "The game is over." Kim Jun sighed, then looked at Minho. "If you want Yura to live, you have to believe me." Minho stares at him intently, then after a few seconds, he lowers his gun. "Good. What's your plan?" Within seconds, chaos erupted. Kim Jun and Minho moved quickly, incapacitating several guards in a single blow. Yura painfully drags Jin out of the room, while Kong Dae-ho shouts for his men to stop them.